people I call retrogrades.
How to re-evangelize the de-Christianized West.
Support us in any way you can, most especially by your prayers.
From an authentically Catholic perspective.
Right-minded, righteous group that's equal in strength to the radicals.
From an authentically masculine perspective.
You and your friends versus me and my friends. Bring it on. Welcome to Rules for Retrogrades. I'm Tim Gordon with my brother Dave. Today we are pleased to be joined by Dr. Jay Richards, a longtime friend and important person in the Catholic world. Dr. Jay Richards is an assistant research professor in the School of Business and Economics at the Catholic University of America, and he's the executive editor at The Stream. Jay is a convert from Presbyterianism to Catholicism. Jay, how are you, bud? Great to see you.
Yeah, good to see you both.
How you doing? Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Yeah, I wanted to talk to Dr. Richards here because he has a new book hitting the bookshelves, I suppose, this upcoming week. It is called Eat, Fast, Feast. It's Collins One Publishing, so that's really that's a great thing. Jay knows how, and I'd like him to impart this knowledge to us, to write a bestseller, and he does this on the regular. So we're excited to be joined by Jay on this book on fasting. We thought it's altogether appropriate for the average American's 3-week New Year's resolution, the average length. And like 95% of them are dieting or fasting related, aren't they, Jay?
No, they are. I mean, this is why, the book could have come out a little earlier, but it was not, I couldn't finish it to come out in September. And the publisher knew, well, let's not have it come out during Christmas because nobody's really going to be interested, even though Advent is a traditional fasting season. So that's why it's actually landing here at the beginning of January. It's right on top of New Year's resolutions, but also in the lead up to Lent. And so the timing definitely makes sense. And honestly, the purpose of the book is to help Christians in particular develop what I call a fasting lifestyle, so that fasting, first of all, it doesn't have to be torture. If you know what you're doing and you understand the human metabolism and the benefits and how to ease into it, you can actually make it part of your lifestyle. So it's plugged into your daily and weekly and seasonal routine, so that it's not just something that, I'm going to read the Bible at the beginning of the year and then you peter out in Leviticus, or I'm going to lose 30 pounds. And the problem with sort of diet resolutions like that is the same problem with all diets in which you're trying to lose weight. Almost all of them involve persistent calorie restriction, where you just try to eat less than you normally do. And those diets mostly work. You can do almost anything, and it works in the short run, and it almost always fails in the long run because you downshift your metabolism if you persistently reduce calories. And so you end up, if you get back to normal, you gain all that weight back and then some. And so everybody that's tried to diet knows this. It works the first few weeks, and then 6 months out, you've lost it. And I'm convinced that part of that, this is a response that we all sort of have. We know it's bad to overeat. It's bad to just continue covering yourself with extra food energy, obviously. But we don't know how to get rid of it. We're incredible epidemic levels of type 2 diabetes and obesity. And I'm convinced part of that, and then just talking on the physical side, is because we have, as a culture and as a church, mostly abandoned the fasting regimens that made up the vast majority of Christian history.
I think there's something obviously to this. I've noticed the last couple of years coming off of Easter and obviously Good Friday, there's a mandatory fast for Catholics. Mm-hmm. And just having been in school and working, you start to get pudgy, right? Like sitting, typing papers or working throughout the day and not getting a chance to work out. And then after Good Friday, and it's been a day of fasting, it's like, well, this isn't so bad.
Yeah.
I think I can diet because I just did it like basically a black fast all day. And I think I can diet. And so then coming off of that, I've actually been most successful in like dieting and getting back to a regimen just because you're chastening yourself, you're chastening the flesh, and then you're like, well, I can do that, right? So there's something like these things go together, like the self-control element of being able to fast goes together with just having continence over the body and over the flesh in general, right?
Absolutely, and that's the sort of traditional wisdom. And Augustine says this, that one of the things fasting does is that you're not punishing your body in the sense that I've got a body, we want to be Gnostics and not have bodies. That's not the point. It's that we want to chastise and order ourselves so that the Spirit governs the kind of bodily impulses. Our bodily impulses don't sort of take over. And so that's one of the things you're doing when you're fasting. But during the last half of the 20th century, this myth emerged, not really from nutritional science, but just kind of in the air, that if you go a long time without eating, your body will go into starvation mode, you'll store a bunch of fat, and you'll lose all your muscle. In fact, I thought this. I was a fitness trainer in college. I taught this to fellow students. Eat 6 small meals a day, eat as soon as you get up and right before you go to bed, kind of consistent protein feed. And so I had this in my mind that, well, fasting is sort of a really bad way to diet because it will create this kind of starvation mode. And what we've discovered actually just in about the last 20 years or so is this is absolutely not true. Now, your body does do that again if you're doing persistent calorie restriction. Your body eventually just says, okay, you need to downshift. And so it slows down, your metabolism slows down. You might start to shed some of your lean body mass. You might start storing fat. Fasting does exactly the opposite. If you eating a little bit of food versus eating no food does 2 different things metabolically. So if you don't eat at all, let's say you don't eat for 3 days, your metabolism actually goes up. Norepinephrine is released and other energy-producing hormones. Growth hormone goes up. So growth hormone, one of the things it does is preserves lean body mass. And this actually makes sense if you think about most of human history. People didn't have constant carb feeds, right, every 5 minutes like we do now. There were times when they had to go hunt stuff, right? And they might not
the
have
cavemen weren't eating Doritos.
No, they didn't have Doritos. It didn't have
not as much.
Not nearly as much. It was always inconvenient. They didn't have cards. Yeah. And so that's the funny thing is that if you think about, okay, how did God design our bodies? It would make no sense that you would just suddenly start losing muscle the second you don't have anything to eat. First of all, muscle doesn't have that much caloric content. It's like 400 calories. Fat's about 35 to 3,700 calories for a pound of fat, right? That's the thing that you would want to use, and that's in fact what the body does. If you're fasting, that is, if you're punctuating your life so that sometimes you're eating moderately, sometimes you're not eating at all, and sometimes you're feasting. You're really going at it. I'm convinced for both theological and physical reasons that that's actually the way we work best.
So it's called Eat, Fast, Feast. This is one I didn't want to say that wrong in the opening. Eat, Fast, Feast. Yeah, you talk about the eating, fasting, feasting cycle. And the book, I noticed in the beginning, I'm not done with it yet, but in the beginning, it's really anti-grazing. That's what you're talking about, the grazing lifestyle where you're told to eat 6 small meals a day, that you're saying this is outmoded wisdom. Mm-hmm. How does eating, fasting, feasting, which is both naturally and supernaturally virtuous, I love how you're so on that point throughout it. Yeah. How is this against what in the 90s was conventional wisdom of graze constantly like some sort of plains animal?
No, exactly. That's this took me honestly a long time to get over myself. I badgered my children to eat early. Don't skip breakfast, because this was just so embedded. But it's all this kind of false mental picture. And the idea is that, well, your blood sugar is going up and down, and so you don't want your blood sugar to get too low. And so if you eat persistently, that will kind of keep your blood sugar steady, which kind of makes sense as long as you actually don't know anything about metabolism. What that actually does is it keeps your blood sugar elevated all the time, and so it keeps your body producing insulin to get the sugar out of your blood. Insulin is this, think of it as a kind of signaling molecule that tells your body, okay, get rid of this sugar, cells open up and take this sugar because it's dangerous to have too much of it in your blood. And so what we're actually doing is we're developing insulin resistance in our bodies, in our cells, which basically if you keep pestering your cells with sugar, they'll put up their defenses. Just like if you say take illegal drugs, you're on cocaine and you keep having to increase the dose in order to get the same same level of high. It's the same thing with insulin. Actually, your body builds up a resistance if it's constantly getting this signal. Take this sugar. The cells can only take so much sugar, and so they take the leftover and they try to push it back out into the blood. The insulin goes up again, so it eventually ends up in the liver, and the liver converts it to fat. It stores it under your skin, but most dangerously around your viscera, around your internal organs. And this is really, really bad for you. And you keep doing this for years and years, you're going to get things like type 2 diabetes. And so we're creating this kind of problem. And it's not just, I of course emphasize this in the book, it's not just people that are drinking 6-packs of Coke every day and doing stuff like that. It's those of us that obeyed this conventional wisdom and are eating oatmeal and doing this, but we're grazing. And the grazing itself essentially doesn't give our metabolism a break. The reality is that our systems are designed, if we're working well, to both to burn sugar and convert the carbohydrates essentially into sugars, but also to be able to convert fats into this fuel called ketones. Our bodies are actually hybrids, but because of the way we eat both really simple carbohydrates and a lot of sugar plus grazing, we get our bodies to basically prefer that sugar burning mode. And so anything that we get that's extra just gets stored as body fat rather than being used as fuel. And so there's this weird irony that it's not just that we got spiritually flaccid in the 20th but it's also that we started eating in a way that made fasting actually much more difficult than it needs to be.
Frequently. Yeah.
Often. Eating free. The two big things are eating really, really frequently, eating for a long period out of a 24-hour day, maybe 16 or 18 hours out of the day that the eating window is open. And then preferentially moving away from natural fats toward artificial fats and especially highly refined carbohydrates, which just turn to sugar as soon as they hit your mouth.
Yeah, right. You have a great line in here. It says, you might think you don't eat much sugar. Maybe you avoid Fruit Loops, Twinkies, and sugary soft drinks. That's good. But if you get most of your calories from grains, then you're still running on sugar. I was thinking to myself as I read this, what about those of us who eat lots of Fruit Loops? and there's just no, I mean, that's me. Me and my kids are just eating Fruit Loops. If you come to visit me at the Gordon household, we're pretty much just eating Fruit Loops all day long. So we're grazing and eating Fruit Loops.
You're doing the whole thing. So
Right,
so you're the perfect test case. And I mean, I could say, depending how old you are, you're younger than me. There was a time when I could actually get away with that. It wasn't like I was incredibly overweight, really for my age overweight at all. Before I started really fasting. And nevertheless, I was not nearly as healthy as I think I ought to be. But the reality is that a lot of us, especially if you're fairly athletic and you're active, you can get away with these bad patterns of eating early on. Kids can often do that. And so we get locked into that pattern. But I can tell you, the older you get, the harder it is to get away with that.
Right. No, I'm learning that. Yeah.
I do generic Fruit Loops. Am I good? Or
no, that sounds terrible. Yeah, all of it is. I mean, hey, look, I come from years of Fruit Loops. When I was a little kid was just the ideal. My mom would only allow us to have healthy cereals, and my best friend, they had all the good cereals. And so, going to his house and eating Fruit Loops was awesome. I'm not saying you should never eat Fruit Loops. I'm just saying that it's probably a bad idea to make it a major part of your diet every day.
You're saying cut back for me to just twice a day, 2 bowls of fruit.
Yeah, minimize it.
Yeah. No, I mean, I do. I in all seriousness, Jay, I have begun fasting a couple years ago. I had it as a semi-regular form of life. And when I was I had a really good routine, and I find it easier to get into this routine when I'm on break. It's much easier when I'm on summer break. I mean, this. It's much easier to get into a really balanced lifestyle of regular prayer, which I really my prayer life suffers during the school year when I'm not on break. But to have real regular patterns of exercise, prayer, some fasting, I'd like to do another year like that. But can you explain to everyone what the eat, fast, feast cycle is? You broke it down in terms of the week, even Wednesday, Friday, Sunday, the rest of the days. I thought that was really a nifty kind of concept.
Yeah, and honestly, the funny thing is you can just look at what the early church did, or you can look at what Eastern Rite and Catholics and Eastern Orthodox Catholics, at least the faithful ones, do now. They have fast at different time scales. So you have, we all have a daily fast of some sort. We're not eating when we're sleeping at the very least, right? And then we break the fast in the morning. That's why it's called breakfast. We're breaking the fast. And so we all have a type of fasting and feasting or eating that we have during the day. Well, the early church and early Christians, very early on, it's already described in the Didache around 110 AD, that Christians fasted on Wednesdays and Fridays. So Wednesday was when Jesus was betrayed, and Friday, of course, when he was crucified. And so in solidarity with Christ, Christians just fasted, literally fasted. So in other words, no calories going in. They're drinking water and stuff like that, no doubt, but just not eating on Wednesdays and Fridays. It took actually a few centuries for our Lenten and Advent traditions to build up, but they were connected to this sense of 40 days, or the number 40 being significant. 40 days, with Jesus in the desert fasting. Moses fasts for 40 days before the 10 Commandments are delivered. There 40 years in the desert. That kind of sense that the number 40 is special. That's where the Lenten fast came. Is that obviously Easter is the primary Christian feast of the Christian year. And so the logic is that, look, it should obviously be preceded by a fast. And it was the same thing with Advent. Christmas is the beginning of the year, and with Advent, and it's a roughly 40-day fast. That's why the vestments and liturgical colors during Advent are purple. It's supposed to be another kind of less intense time of penitence and preparation. That's been completely lost. And then for a long time, Christians celebrated the so-called Ember Days fasts, which are 3-day fasts, basically at the joints of the seasons, the actual astronomical seasons, where you fast Wednesday, Friday, and Saturday, so you just add an extra day. So think of that. Right. So just normal life, it wasn't a liturgical thing. Christians were eating for a limited amount of time during the day, right? They had a twice a week daily fast, and then they had a little feast every Sunday. So it's not like, we're going to have a cheat day. No, the Sunday is a mini feast. And then they had these massive feasting seasons. And I think that makes it actually much easier. If you realize that's a part of the fasting lifestyle, the feast is a part of it. It's not, you're not taking a break. You're not cheating from fasting. It's a part of the lifestyle. The problem is that we have retained the feast and we drop the fast.
What's the importance of this paradigm of fasting and leading up to a time of feasting? Does that have theological significance?
Yeah, I mean, I think that certainly if you just look at, okay, why did Christians come up with Lent? The idea was that we want to essentially associate ourselves with the suffering of Christ in the lead up to the Passion, right? And so the resurrection comes, but the crucifixion precedes us, and there's that long road to Jerusalem that leads up to it. There's also Jesus' 40 days in the desert right before his earthly ministry. So you think about this. Okay, so he's getting ready to do battle with the principalities and powers of darkness in the universe, right? In his ministry. And what does he do? Does he carb load? Is he doing HIIT training? Or, no. He goes into the desert and he doesn't eat for 40 days, and the devil tempts him at the end. And this was Christ in his humanity. He was hungry, right? The first temptation is, Satan says, hey, you could easily turn this rock into bread. That's kind of counterintuitive to us because we think, well, fasting, that's going to make me weak. But in fact, it seems to it actually, in a sense, makes Jesus strong. He does it before the battle. And that's what all the church fathers say this. They look, if you're going to battle Satan, if you're going to do exorcisms, you need to be fasting. And that's a kind of counterintuitive thing to us. But I think that's absolutely true spiritually. And now we're discovering, that's honestly why I wrote the book, all the scientific literature that shows these physiological benefits to fasts at different time scales again. So I actually think it's the wisdom of the church to have had a fasting regimes that follow different time scales throughout our lives, just as we have meaningful time scales. And as it turns out, there are also physical benefits that correspond to those different time scales. I just think that's a remarkable act of providence.
Sure. Yeah. And for Christ to fast, because Christ, obviously, there's not concupiscence at work within Christ. He's preserved from, obviously, through his mother. There's no stain of original sin in Christ's humanity. Obviously, he's fasting for a reason where it's not just to chasten the flesh, because obviously the flesh is united to the spirit. It's totally under the domain of his human and divine will. Mm-hmm. Why would Christ need to fast? Why would that be a beneficial thing for the God-man?
Well, it's somewhat mysterious in the same way that Jesus gets baptized, right? In the same way that, in the Gospels when the disciples go out and they're trying to drive out demons, and this complicated kind of passage in Scripture where he says, well, those kind come out only by prayer and fasting. There's this sense in the early church that these things are actually supposed to go together. And so I do think it's a bit mysterious in the same way that Christ's baptism is. Obviously, he didn't need to have sins washed away, but he does it, I think, in part as a model for us. And that's the thing that I think is missing, because we're not commanded in the New Testament. Jesus nowhere says, okay, now you need to fast. But that's because he presupposes that we're going to fast. He tells his disciples, when you pray, don't do it like the Pharisees. When you give alms, don't do it ostentatiously. And when you fast, don't walk around looking like you're haggard and depressed. In other words, you don't do these things to try to get worldly approval or virtue signaling. You do it because, of course, you're supposed to do it as a part of the spiritual life. And so when people say, well, Jesus didn't command us to fast, they say, no, that's because he took it for granted that we would do it. And the church, for most of history, actually understood that. We formalized it in different ways. But the formalizations over time started to get more and more arbitrary. And so I do think the story is sort of complicated, because something like, not eating animal flesh, not eating meat on Fridays, well, that would make a lot of sense to a culture, say, of shepherds, in which most of their food would come from sheep and lamb, and you don't have access to fish. So saying that you're not able to eat that on Fridays is essentially a command to just eat vegetables. Of course, 21st century America not eating anything but fish on Fridays. I can get lobster bisque and fish and chips. Right. It's like the logic of this is sort of lost. And so it starts over time, these kind of complicated dispensations started to look arbitrary. It was like, why that? Why can I eat lobster, but I can't, or cheese pizza, right? But I can't eat a fried chicken. It just looks strange.
There it is. It's always cheese pizza.
Yeah, it's always cheese pizza. But so the logic kind of falls apart. And then you get Vatican II, and the strictures are released. But this was already happening 100 years ago. If you read the Catholic Encyclopedia, 1909, 1910, they were talking about the collapse of fasting as a discipline.
Well, it's so funny because, things are a lot different from the biblical days, I've noticed. Because, Christ is saying, if you are fasting, make sure you perk up, don't walk around looking, like you said, haggard. Obviously, we're paraphrasing the words of Christ. Right. But it's the modern Western culture is so different from biblical times. Like, if I saw someone walking down the street and they look tired and cranky, the last thing in my mind would be like, oh man, he's got a mega heck of a fast. Yeah. It's just like his second car must have broken down or something like that, or his TV must be out of commission.
Something
like we're
wrong.
Not level anymore.
Yeah, exactly. His cell coverage is really bad all of a sudden. But that shows you that it was just a common thing, right? So that people would sort of think this. And what's funny about fasting and feasting too is that it replicates in a religious form a natural pattern that humans would have had for thousands of years. And so no one's surprised, including the church fathers, that fasting exists in every time and place. It existed in every religion. In fact, the church fathers say that fasting, although there's specifically Christian fast, the command to fast and even to feast is actually for the human race. They saw this when they said, look, at the beginning in Genesis, when God commands Adam and Eve, you can eat everything in the garden, but for this one tree. They saw that as a type of fast, a command not to eat a certain thing. And then there's this feast at the end in the book of Revelation, this heavenly wedding feast, this wedding supper of the Lamb, in which we're in the kingdom of God in its fullness, right? And so there's this pattern across salvation history. And the church fathers said, look, this is intended for everyone. So we shouldn't be surprised that Jews fast and Zoroastrians don't really fast. But, if they had been talking about, we know the Buddhists fast, the Hindus fast. There's this kind of religious intuition that we're really supposed to do this. And so the outliers are actually modern people who, on the one hand, we benefit from the fact that we really never have food scarcity. That's a blessing. I don't want to act like that's a curse. But even blessings come at a cost. And so we need to find a way to enjoy the blessings and mitigate the costs insofar as we can.
Jay, you're right. This is the line I was talking about that I love. A careful outside observer, circa AD 600, would have noticed that Christians ate modestly on most days, ate little or nothing on Wednesdays and Fridays, and feasted on Sundays. I guess this corresponds to the logic of Dave's joke. Christians nowadays don't even understand that the days you're mentioning, Wednesday, Friday, Sunday, weren't randomly selected, right?
No,
Or these just picked
no,
out of a hat, much less why you selected them. So what
that's right.
happened? I mean,
Well,
yeah.
yeah, it's a long and complicated story, and it involves both the complication of regional dispensations. And so everybody knew, okay, there's not an absolute prohibition on eating animal flesh on Fridays or something. Obviously, this is a discipline. It made sense early on, but the original discipline was not eating. That was the original, right? That's what the word fast primarily means, don't eat. But then people in different situations thought, well, okay, this is actually really hard if you're a farm worker for some people. And they started saying, well, John the Baptist, he ate locusts and honey in the desert. And he was hardcore, so maybe can't we eat locusts?
Honey, at least.
Yeah, at least honey. And but though the problem is that people didn't have, honey was hard to find. It didn't have a lot of honey farmers. And so then people thought, well, what about shrimp? Aren't those just kind of sea locusts? Can't we eat shrimp? And so it's like, yeah, okay, that makes sense. And then it's like, well, wait, but if we can eat shrimp, why can't we eat this non-fatty form of fish? Yeah, because it's not really that different. And then so you end up with these debates about, well, is olive oil okay? Is it like butter? Is butter okay? Can we have fatty fish or just lean fish? This is how it ends up. And then you get these regional dispensations for different people's working patterns. And then people immigrate all over the world. And the fish thing doesn't make any sense eventually because it's not even really a sacrifice. It's a mild inconvenience for me to eat. Like we ate last night. We had shrimp, really good garlic shrimp that my daughter is amazing. We had, a blackened orange roughy. Come on, right?
So I'm not a martyr for going to sushi on Friday. Like, dang it, it's Friday. I have to go to a $70 sushi meal.
Yeah, exactly. So the actual fasting regimens that we had developed started to look arbitrary. That was part of it. The other part of it is that I do think we've just gotten weaker. Spiritually, most Christians don't suffer persecution. I notice there's an amazing correlation between those Christian communions that are persecuted for their faith as a regular part of existence and hardcore fasting. So Egyptian Christians, hardcore fasters. Ethiopian Christians, 250 days out of the 365-day year are fasting days. And I'm telling you that these Ethiopian Christians, they actually do that. And a lot of these are water-only days. So we're spiritually flaccid. And then the last part of the puzzle is that our modern way of eating, our constant frequency of the way that we eat fat, I think all those things together have made fasting just sort of passé for a lot of people. And even for those Christians that want to do it, if you're eating that way and then you just decide you're not going to eat for a day, it's really, really hard. And you have a hard time seeing, how's this going to help my spiritual life if I am fixated on when I can get to Krispy Kreme? And I think it's all those things. And so that's why I think a solution is going to take account of all of our knowledge of human physiology and metabolism. And I honestly think what we need to do is just recover those older ways of fasting from the first few centuries.
It makes sense that it would help with the spirit of detachment from created goods, right? Mm-hmm. I think it's no surprise that as Western culture has become more materialistic and hedonistic, we're seeing that coincide with kind of the downfall of fasting. These acts of detachment are naturally going to decline. Do you think there's something to that?
Oh, absolutely. I think that in some ways that's sort of a no-brainer. If you think about the fact that even no matter how secular our culture gets, we still retain Christmas, right? And even that period, it's kind of now it's actually starts at Thanksgiving and it ends at kind of after New Year's Day. It's a big feast, right? There's economic incentive to doing that. We like feasts for obvious reasons, right? There's not any real strong economic incentive to tell people, okay, we're going to eat a lot less, for 40 days before Christmas and Easter, because it is a discipline. I would say it's a sacrifice, but it absolutely should not be torture. But we're seeing the effects of this, I think, both spiritually and physically, of abandoning it. And that's sort of the irony of fasting in 2020, is that I kind of stumbled into the effects of fasting. It's a long story. But what I found is that there are these tech bros in California were trying this purely as a body hack, just because it improves mental acuity and it seems to help metabolic markers and things like that for not spiritual reasons at all. So you had people that were interested in sort of physical performance. Suddenly they're fasting for therapeutic reasons. There is an obesity and diabetes doctor in Toronto that starts a clinic specifically using fasting to reverse type 2 diabetes. His name is Jason Fung. He actually wrote the foreword to the book. And these are happening for non-spiritual reasons, right? And this is all happening at the same time that Christians have mostly abandoned it. And I thought, we should be at the very front of this. We should be saying, what took you so long? And instead, we're just now catching up. And that's sort of the irony, is that you have these kind of the spiritual reasons for fasting and the physical reasons, and they've gotten detached. And I think, look, Christian theology says we're body-soul unities, that we're both these things. We're not just spirits, we're not just bodies. We're both these things in this unique unity. And so we should expect that they're going to be both beneficial, physical and spiritual benefits, and that's what I think is actually the case.
Yeah, that's my favorite part about the book so far. Is that the hylomorphic approach to fasting?
Mm-hmm.
There's natural and supernatural
Yes.
virtue to doing it, and that's ironically you incentivize the formal through the material.
Yeah.
Maybe it's not that ironic. Maybe that's just modern America 2020 or the modern West. Why is this why you wrote the book, Jay? Did you sit down and think, we need to be at the front of this as Christians?
That's why I wrote it, because I started writing and talking about it a few years ago during Lent, and I wrote a series on fasting during Lent. Just thought, gosh, people should do this. I was doing it. I was so excited. I felt like I got to tell other people about it. And I had a lot of people, when I would talk about it, in say breakfast prayer groups, they'd say, gosh, you have to write a book about this, because nobody's talking about all these new scientific evidences that are coming out. And most of the people, I had read some kind of, let's call them Catholic books on fasting, and they were very careful to say, okay, now I'm not talking about fasting for therapeutic reasons. Don't do that. That would be bad. We're just fasting for spiritual reasons. And I thought that kind of set up an artificial dilemma, because of course you don't want to just fast for physical reasons and abandon the spiritual, but that's kind of a bad spirituality that says that these things have to be at odds. You just want these things to be properly ordered. And no one had actually combined the emerging scientific case for fasting with the historical and the theological case. And so, as you said, I saw an opportunity to kind of make the hylomorphic case for fasting, and also to be able to make an argument for the real presence and the importance of that, which is, of course, the supreme feast that we participate in every week at least. But I wrote it also, of course, I'm Catholic, and so the book, anybody that reads it that knows theology knows, okay, this is a Catholic book. But I did my very best to write it for Christians, and it would be an awesome thing if Catholics and Orthodox and our separated brethren who are Protestants all started doing this. We connect our fasting to the calendar. We start praying about these things. And the divisions in the body of Christ, I think, scandalize the world, and they weaken our witness. And I just think that honestly, I just feel like I just feel called to say that this is something that we ought to do. Not because I got a private message from the Holy Spirit, but because if you look at Scripture and you look at longstanding Christian practice, what's missing? Well, this is a major part of the Christian life for most of human history, and we have mostly dropped it, except for what I'll call the kind of vestigial fasting, Ash Wednesday, Good Friday, and that hour before Mass when we fast, which you do automatically if you shower. So I mean, it does not work.
Unless you're eating pizza on the way to church,
yes,
you're pretty much good.
Yes,
it's
exactly.
Before the Eucharist, right? You got 45-minute buffer zone. So it's like if you didn't eat 15 minutes before you went to church, you're good. Man, 15 minutes, what am I going to do?
I know, it's so hardcore. I know. I mean, in some ways it sort of tells you, okay, this is just vestigial. It's just purely this kind of symbolic thing, which is like the last thing you do before you abandon it entirely. I think we need to go in exactly the opposite direction.
Is the church letting us down by not commanding? They have the binding and loosing power, which is given to obviously Peter and his successors personally, but also to the apostles and their successors collectively, the bishops collectively. So when we have the USCCB watering down all of our fasting rules, and basically all the Western bishops conferences watering down all the fasting rules, so that basically don't eat 10 minutes before Mass, and on Friday you can eat meat if you can substitute something else, even another kind of penance or mortification so that you don't have to not eat meat anymore. Don't even worry about it. We're watering down the rules so much. are they doing us a disservice?
I mean, I think so. I looked into this because I initially thought, I thought, well, a lot of this dropped out in the 60s. It must have been Vatican II. I looked at it. It was actually more of a mixed kind of message in my sense because Paul VI, yeah, he made the eating fish only on Fridays optional except during Lent. But he also said that throughout the years, you said that people should give up something that's truly sacrificial. Now, that's partially a response to his recognition that the eating fish had ceased to be sacrificial in the 20th century. And so what he wanted to do is say, okay, everybody needs to do something that's actually sacrificial. So that, so far as it goes, that was good. But then he also, it was the same thing with the Ember Days fast. They didn't make it mandatory, but they left it to the national bishops' conferences to set the dates. And most of them just didn't do it. And so I think just as we as lay people have gotten spiritually flaccid, I think that our shepherds do too. And so the reality is that most priests don't do this either, in part because they're a part of the culture and they're part of our eating patterns as well. And so I do think that reform needed to be made because the kind of corporate fast rules had come to seem arbitrary. I just think the mistake was to say, okay, let's just kind of make it mostly optional and complicated and turn it into symbolic things. I think we should return to what the church was doing early on so that it's actually really serious. And I think certainly the bishops have the authority to do that and do it in a way that's not arbitrary. As Tim said earlier, Wednesdays and Fridays that's not arbitrary. That fits during the Passion Week, and Sunday, of course, that one's obvious, right? And then have these real fasts and real feasts
Right.
according to the liturgical seasons. None of that would be arbitrary. And so my argument would be, look, let's take a look at what actually makes sense physiologically and what makes sense liturgically and return to that rather than doing what we're doing, which is to just entirely spiritualize it and so end up making it optional.
Well, make it less, instead of loosening all these rules, make the fasting something that's a little bit more hardcore and a little bit more structured, is what I'm hearing you say. Yeah,
absolutely.
It doesn't make sense to be, go eat your lobster dinner on Friday and then pretend that was a big sacrifice. Instead, it's like, let's get back to the rules of the early church where, and it doesn't necessarily have to be this Spartan, but like no fish, no meat, no dairy during, Lent. That's a fast. Basically bread and water type stuff.
Yeah, well, that's right. I mean, the real fast is just not eating anything but drinking liquids, like non-caloric liquids, essentially. And so dry fasts have been almost non-existent in the Christian world. The Muslim fast during the month of Ramadan, it's actually a dry fast. So if you think this is impossible, they do it for a month, right? They don't eat when the sun's up. So if let's say Ramadan lands in June and you live in someplace in the northern hemisphere, right? That's most of your day you're not eating. They do this all over the world, and we've completely abandoned it, and we wonder why we're so weak spiritually. The good news is I think because the church has become lax, we're not under any official obligation to do a lot of this stuff. It doesn't mean we can't do it, and it doesn't mean that if we were to do it from the grassroots up, build a movement in which we all start taking this much more seriously. I think that'd be a powerful thing. And that's actually, after all, it's kind of how it happened in the early church. There were rules about Wednesday and Friday in the Didache, but it took a while for these things to develop, and then it took a while for it to fall apart. And we're just here at the end when it's completely fallen apart, and we have to ask, okay, what do we need to do to recover it?
Yeah, our viewers don't tend to be the type that need much of a kick in the pants to do these sorts of things. Our viewers are the kind that are doing a daily rosary, that are fasting on, or at least abstaining from meat on Fridays throughout the year, that are wanting a Lenten promise that is chastening and binding in a way that'll challenge them. The problem, I guess Dave's point is, the problem is the ignorance that abides in the average, congregation out there. They don't even know. It was another one of my favorite parts of your book. You're just talking about the complete lack of ignorance in most congregations. Probably most parish priests don't know much about the history of fasting. It's staggering. The other half of this, it's kind of the elephant in the room, is the obesity epidemic, which you address in really, I think, gratifying ways and glancing blows throughout the open of your book, Jay. Yeah. It's the obesity epidemic in America over the last 10 years has been molded by certain special interest groups. One of them are feminists, to be another untouchable identity politic, right? 10 years ago, I remember 15 years ago, maybe it was 20, movie Super Size Me came out. Remember
You're
the
right.
documentarian guy that talks about how fat we are? And everyone, I mean, particularly good, left-leaning liberals got on board and they're like, yeah, Americans are fat. The SAD, the Standard
Right.
American Diet. That's the first time I ever heard that term was in that
Yeah.
that documentary. They jumped on board. Nowadays, in 15 or 20 years, the political landscape has been rearranged by these
Hmm.
liberals such that one can't even say anymore. One doesn't hear it very often anymore. Look, we're gluttons
Hmm.
spiritually. That's not what the supersize me guy was saying, but just saying
Right.
we're fat. What?
Yeah.
How? I mean, you address this in a way where I think you say, uh, you note that obesity, type 2 diabetes have spiked in the last 40
Oh,
years.
it's terrible. Yeah, it
So,
really is. So, I mean, it's kind of a complicated story because it's actually possible that somebody could be eating well, doing, for instance, let's say,
right,
people's obviously genetic propensities vary, and so that's the truth of the matter is you don't know for sure somebody that's overweight is as much of a glutton as somebody that just has a crazy metabolism, right? I mean, I used to eat 5,000 calories a day in high school, and I was 140 pounds. It just wouldn't budge. And so a lot of people, I mean, the truth of the matter is if you just look at the numbers, though, adult obesity has gone through the roof. Adult type 2, so it used to be called adult onset diabetes, is now becoming more and more of a crisis actually with kids. And so we're clearly doing something wrong. And so in the book, I emphasize the fact that, look, gluttony is still a sin, but it's also complicated by the fact that the official smart people have told us to eat in a certain way that itself
right.
is feeding the crisis. And so honestly, I mean, when I see somebody that's overweight and they're trying to eat a salad, I feel bad for them because what they're probably doing is the pattern in the way in which they're eating is that they're constantly hungry because they're spiking their blood sugar with a lot of carbs, and then their body is storing all this food energy. That's the irony, is if you get it in this vicious cycle, can be storing all this food energy in the form of fat, and you can still be starving because your body's not accessing those fuel stores. They're like reservoirs that you buried deep in the ground where you can't get to them. So in my book, I have a 6-week plan in which I start by getting readers to eat ketogenically. So to eat ketogenically just means to eat in such a way that your body will use fat for fuel. And the easiest way to do that is to eat a ketogenic diet, which is very, very low carbohydrate. So all your carbs come, say, from leafy green vegetables, kind of moderate protein, and then very high in natural fats. And within a few days of doing this, your body gets rid of all its carbohydrates. It uses up all the sugars that it has stored, and then your liver starts converting fats to ketones, both from your diet and from your body. That's going to be good for you if you're overweight because now your body's able to use these fat stores. It's also going to prime you for fasting because when you're in that state of ketosis, your blood sugars level. You don't feel starving. You don't have this kind of up and down cycles that we're all used to. And so fasting is actually much easier. So really, there are only 2 ways to get into that state of ketosis. Either don't eat for 3 days. That's the really hard way. Or eat ketogenically for a few days. That's the easy way. And so that's why in this 6-week plan, the first week is just focusing on eating ketogenically because it's a way to ease into it for people that just are not used to that.
So give us some examples of foods they should eat to be ketogenic? Is this just sit around and eat lard? Obviously not. What's the best? What's going to set you back the least?
Yeah.
Can we eat lard though?
You can
there's
eat
that.
lard. You're
allowed
fine
to.
eating lard. You're perfectly fine eating lard. You're perfectly fine. Basically, the simple way of putting it is natural fats. So stuff that's actually is found in nature, right? Either plant fats from things like avocados and olives or animal fats. I don't think there's actually any good reason. I'm not saying that industrial seed oils will kill you, but I don't actually think there's any positive health reason for doing that. I think it's a myth. So there's no reason to do that. And then eat moderate protein because protein also affects your insulin levels, not nearly as much as carbohydrates, but it does affect that. And then eat very little carbohydrates. So that is 50 grams or less per day, which basically means get your carbs from salad and spinach and bok choy and broccoli and stuff like that. Those are carbohydrates, but they're very low glycemic. In other words, they do hardly anything to your blood sugar. And so what you're doing when you do this, just to kind of understand the biology a little bit, is that you're getting your insulin levels way down. And so when your insulin levels are way down, your body's basically is being told, okay, you can use fat for fuel. So if fat comes into the diet, you don't store it, use it for fuel. Oh, you don't have enough coming in? Okay, take some of this fat that's wrapped around the liver here and use that for fuel. That only is going to happen for most people when your insulin goes low and it stays low. And so it's in that process of ketosis where your insulin is low, you've depleted your stores of carbohydrates, that you're in this state in which you're both burning fat and which make fasting really, really easy. Now, my goal in the book is not to make everybody have to eat a ketogenic diet for the rest of their lives. It's to make you metabolically flexible. So in other words, make it so that your body is able to switch easily between carb burning, that is carb converted to sugar and using that for fuel, or taking fats and convert those to ketones. Our body's actually a hybrid, like a Prius, that can use electricity or gasoline. But what we've been doing is we've just been using the battery for most of us for decades. We just use the sugar carbohydrate cycle. We don't use fats for fuel. And so that part's rusty. And so anybody that's going to make fasting part of their lifestyle has got to get both of those metabolic pathways in working order. And so that's what the plan is designed to do.
It's interesting. That's very interesting. So yeah, I guess the question is, people that are wanting to follow this plan you lay out, how hard will it be the first 2-3 weeks for the average person that's never fasted and never centered on ketones and eating ketogenically? How have you streamlined it to the point where it'll be easy for them?
Absolutely. In fact, this is the fruit of years of self-tinkering. So I kind of notorious for doing the so-called N=1 experiments, where you sample size of one, you just try it on yourself and see what it actually does. Learn some things the hard way. And so one of the things, people that have done an Atkins diet, which is a low carb diet, often talked about getting the Atkins or the keto flu, which is like you just feel weird when all of a sudden you're not eating any carbohydrates. The reason is because when you eat carbs come with water. And so your body holds on to water when you are storing carbohydrates. When you quit consuming carbohydrates, your body flushes all that fluid, and out goes a lot of electrolytes with the fluid. So things like sodium and potassium. And so basically when you start eating ketogenically, you got to bump up the amount of liquid that you're consuming, and you got to bump up the amount of salt and things like that. So you actually increase your salt intake. That keeps your electrolytes right. And then the real bumps, I think, in getting into ketosis are mostly taken care of. But anybody that's done a 3-week diet and had to restrict calories to 1,200 calories a day, this is super easy compared to that. Yes, it's a sacrifice. Yes, it takes some discipline and some concentration. But fasting is not supposed to be torture. I had a friend say, "Well, Jay, you're going to make this so easy." I said, "No, it's still a sacrifice." But if every time you prayed you got nauseated and got a terrible migraine and had to go to bed, that wouldn't be a sign that, well, just keep praying. It'd be like, okay, you must be doing something wrong. It's not supposed to be that. It's not supposed to
You might be possessed.
You might be possessed. This may not be the prayer that's the problem. And in the same way, fasting is a sacrifice, but it's actually supposed to improve your spiritual life. And so if it's absolute torture for you, that probably tells you you're not quite doing it right. What you want it to be is a sacrifice and a discipline, but it's something that you can do. You can actually make it a habit. You can make it a virtue if you practice it long enough. And so the plan is really designed as an easy on-ramp for somebody that's never really fasted at all. That's the target audience for the book. But of course, anybody that's tried fasting will just be that much further ahead.
Yeah. So over Christmas break, I've been, largely because we have this bizarre monster cold that you can still hear in my voice. I've had it for 2 weeks plus. I've fallen to eating about 1.5 times a day. The conventional grazing wisdom would hate that.
Absolutely.
This book, which I've been reading over the last 2 weeks, actually makes me feel kind of good. That's a step in the right direction, is it not? Is it? Well, yeah.
It absolutely is. I mean, that's the first week of the plan is just start eating ketogenically. And then weeks 2 through 5, you're basically limiting the time window in which you eat. So first you limit it to 8 hours. So in other words, you can eat all the meals you normally eat, but you just do it in an 8-hour window. And then you move it to a 4-hour window. So that means 20 hours out of the day, no eating, including the time you sleep, and then 4 hours you eat. Then you limit it to 1 hour a day. So you can eat, it's called one meal a day. You can eat as much as you normally do if you can, right? But it's all in 1 hour. And then it's not until that 5th week that you do a so-called fasting mimicking diet, where at least a couple of those days, and ideally 3, you only eat about 500 calories, so like a couple of avocados, which is really not a whole lot of food. And once that's happened, you're in a position where you could do a 36 to 72 hour water only fast in the 6th week. But people that have never fasted, I would advise don't try a water only fast for 3 days if you've never done it. It's just, you might be able to do it, right? You'd survive if somebody locked you up and didn't feed you. But it's torturous, and you're very unlikely to make it a part of a lifestyle and to make it a habit if you do it that way.
How often do you suggest doing a water only fast?
Well, and so it depends. It's sort of relative to what a person's situation is. So if your body mass index is really, really low, obviously what you do is going to be different than if you have a whole lot of extra food storage. But for a lot of people, I honestly think
That's me.
Okay, the early church protocol is great. I think 2 days of fasting, and I generally, at least during the week, do at least time restricted eating, or so-called intermittent fasting, most days, just because I think it keeps you in this cycle. And then a mini feast on Sundays where you really enjoy yourself, and you do that every single week. And actually, after a few weeks, you do that. And so I would say for the average American, the average Catholic that's 30 or 40 pounds overweight, there's absolutely no reason why you can't do that and why it wouldn't be beneficial to you both physically and spiritually. Now, of course, there are exceptions. If you're extremely underweight, or if you have an eating disorder, or let's say you're taking insulin because you have type 2 diabetes, you need to talk to your doctor, because fasting it's going to lower your blood sugar. And so if you take insulin shots and it lowers it even more, you could end up with low blood sugar. So what you do if you're taking diabetes medications is you reduce the dosage when you do this. There's a way to do it, but it's smart to have a doctor that you're talking to if you're in that situation.
You just used a term that I thought I was complimented the other day. I was in the store, and a little girl said to her mom, "Oh, look, that guy is an excellent food store." I thought she meant whatever. She was calling me fat.
That's right. So she's doing it in a very clinical way, though. Look, mommy, he's prepared for the next famine. He's set.
Right.
I am not obese. I am just smart. I'm thinking ahead.
You're preparing. You're a prepper. Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, and that's how God made us. It's smart. So if you think about the way most people lived, at least in pre-industrial eras, you come upon a big store of berries in the summer. You want honey, right? You want to add extra body fat, and you want to be able to store that for a time when food is scarce. We live in a time where we have actually solved that problem, or most of us have. And so we have another problem, right? And anybody that studies economics knows that every good thing comes with some cost. It's just that what you want is for the benefits to exceed the cost. So I'm not one of these people says, "Oh, we need to go back to pre-agricultural days and I'll start rubbing sticks together." No. It's just that even the blessing of abundance has a cost. And it has a cost that I think we need to become conscious of and do things to counteract it.
Yeah. Let me ask, it seems like kind of one of the themes here, at least one of the built-in themes that we've been talking about is, fasting gives kind of a meaning to the week. Obviously, if you're on Wednesday and Friday, missing meals and offering this suffering up to God, it puts you in this liturgical mode where you're really thinking about you're contemplating through your daily life, through your actions, the life of Christ, and basically the Paschal mystery. And to have days where you are missing weekly a meal and offering things up to God, and then a day of feasting, and it puts you in this mode. Obviously, if you're feasting on Sunday, it's putting you in this kind of heavenly preparation mode, like looking ahead to the last things and to the beatific vision and the wedding feast of the Lamb. To be missing that and basically be in feast mode all week, even though that's dissonant with our situation as a pilgrim church, as a church that is in this time of not just rejoicing, but also of trial. We're wandering in the desert. We're still trying to find heaven. We're still trying to attain our final end and the vision of God. That's got to be a pretty negative thing, right? To have completely lost this semblance and this, this ability to look ahead at the last things, but also to look behind and to contemplate on the life of Christ.
That's right. That's why I think there's such wisdom in these different time scales, because you're basically sanctifying every moment of time. So even the daytime scale you've got this back and forth between eating and fasting. You do it at the weekly scale. We've retained the feast as Christians. We all, of course, recognize Sunday. We recognize the major liturgical seasons, but we've dropped the fast. And I've not been able to find anyone that can explain to me, any Christian, Catholic or not, that can explain, okay, why do we think that we're not supposed to fast? Why do we think that the church thought you were supposed to do this for so long? Jesus assumed we were going to do it, and we can just all drop it with impunity. I mean, we should assume, if anything, that there's probably a serious cost to this.
And the moral life, right? Because fasting goes arm in arm with the spirit chastening the flesh. So
Yes.
it stands to reason that if we lose the notion of fasting, if we lose this idea of the mind, the rational soul, having continence and basically controlling the body as it should be, right? The body shouldn't control the mind. The mind should control the body, because the higher should control the lower. So the spirit should control the flesh. If we lose that, there are ramifications for the moral life, are there not?
Absolutely. I mean, I think, and this is what, if you read the church fathers on this, they're remarkably integrated. They talk about, St. Basil the Great that I opened the book with. He says, fasting's a safeguard for the soul, a steadfast companion for the body, a weapon for the valiant, a gymnasium for athletes, right? It's all this stuff bundled together. Fasting repels temptations. It anoints unto piety. It's all these things. And they're all going on and on about this. Augustine does the same thing. But the problem is we get in our heads that, well, is this kind of Gnostic? Are we punishing the body? No, that's not what they're saying. To say to chastise the body, we're also chastising the soul. This is a unified act in which we're combining our spiritual life and our physical existence simultaneously. And so I think it's just something that I think we've lost, and we've lost it to both our spiritual and our physical detriment.
Yeah. It's a great book. I mean, in addition to being a well-written book, it's one of the most nice feeling books I've ever felt. So yeah, I mean, have you actually given this thing a pat? It's really Collins One does a good job here. It's in a
you got yours before I actually got mine. I think I've got one copy at the moment. That's how fresh this is. But yeah, I was really pleased. I'm pleased that they did the Eucharistic symbolism on the front, and I'm really pleased with how it turned out. And we spent, it went through a lot of copy editing and fact checking, obviously, because it's not just theology. It's a heck of a lot of, I spent a year reading a lot of PubMed stuff, and so it's easy to make mistakes, right? So I was glad to sort of have that protection before we released it.
Impressive amount of nutritional science in here. Yeah, I just mean even I want, me and Dave have 2 books coming out in 2020. I'd like them to be covered like that. You got the smooth kind of gloss on the foods here, and then you have the kind of rough matted finish on the rest of it. It's a fun book to pat as you're reading it. Is that a weird habit I have?
Not at all. I know exactly what you mean. There's something to that, the kind of tactile nature of the thing.
Yeah,
I think so.
Yeah, it's great. No, and excellently written. And final question, because we're out of time. Lurking kind of behind, not looming larger, but behind all of these questions of, why are we now struggling with fasting, whereas we weren't before? It's decadence and all the rest. But it's the upside of the market. I'm just saying this, after you came on with Taylor and I, and we talked about distributus and your excellent work with Dr. Witt on The Hobbit Party. Excellent book. Everyone go read that. We weren't beating up on distributism, but we were being kind. But man, I still get hate mail from that. Do you get sick of being called a libertarian? I was getting called libertarian yesterday.
No, I get called libertarian. I get called, it's like people call me a Randian, a disciple of Ayn Rand. Right. Well, if you Google Jay Richards and Ayn Rand, I've never written a positive thing about her. And so it's like, look, folks, we need more refined categories on these things. And
the School of Salamanca. Get it right.
The School of Salamanca. Yeah, there's a lot of important stuff. And, I joked about this book being sort of off the beaten path for me, because I tend to write on sort of faith and economic stuff. And my friend corrected me. She said, Jay, you've been doing this kind of stuff your whole life. You've been interested in fitness and nutrition. You've had these weird physical issues that you've had to work through. And so in some ways, it's kind of it brings to fruition my avocational interest in health and fitness, but also, of course, my interest in the intersection of theology and science. But if you'd asked me 5 years ago if I was going to write a book on fasting, I'd have been, yeah, no way. But, that you find yourself with these opportunities.
Very admirable. Yeah, you're a man of many parts. You're you know many of these things, and I find a lot of that seeps into the writing of this. Actually, Jay, many people don't know, he's one of the first important people in Catholicism that helped me out. I remember when I was still working at the law firm. This is 2013. I had a phone conversation with you. And I was like, man, I can't get through the writing of Catholic Republic. I'm like one chapter in. And I'm working 60 hours a week at a law firm. And you told me, this is an image I've given to many, I've passed on, Jay, to many young Catholic authors, is you said writing your first book is like building a platform of ice while standing on it. Once you get through it, the other ones come naturally. And that's so true. Yeah, you really, do you remember that image, or did you pass it to many?
I don't really remember that image, though. I have told people that's kind of paradox, is that, like publishing a book, it helps if you have a platform, and the best way to have a platform is to have a book that you've published. And so, and also, if you've never written a book, you think you have to put everything you've ever thought into that book because it's your only chance, but no book that has everything you ever thought is going to be worth reading, and so those are the tough things, is once you learn that, it's like, okay, this book is about one thing that I find interesting and important. It's not about everything.
That's right. Oh, great advice, and I'm still indebted to you. So, Jay Richards, everybody, we're super flattered you came on. Best of luck with this thing. Eat, Fast, Feast. It comes out Tuesday, and we're a little ahead of the curve. Yeah, great book so far. Great read, and God bless you, Jay. Thanks a million, man. Come back on with us.
Thanks so much for coming on,
guys. Absolutely.
Okay.
God bless.
We'll see you around Rules for Retrogrades way soon. Everyone hit subscribe, like, and please share with your friends. We will be back with you on Wednesday. Thank you.